In the heart of America's history, a dark and disturbing chapter unfolded, one that profoundly shaped the nation's soul and continues to echo through the corridors of time. This is the story of slavery, a system that dehumanized millions and divided a nation. It is a tale of greed, power, and the insidious ways in which human beings can justify the most heinous acts. As we delve into this narrative, we must confront the harsh realities that underpin the institution of slavery and the lengths to which some went to maintain it. The Southern planters, who owned vast tracts of land and countless human beings, found themselves increasingly dependent on a system that was not only morally bankrupt, but also economically precarious. As the 19th century progressed, the economic power of the planters began to wane, but their political power became more crucial than ever. With 4 million slaves, they could balance the votes of 2.4 million Northern voters, ensuring that their interests were protected. However, the thought of these slaves gaining freedom was a nightmare to them, as it would mean an overwhelming number of new voters who could tip the balance of power. This fear became a reality in 1868, when the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. As the Southern planters' economic grip weakened, they clung to their political influence with increasing desperation. They turned to more systematic exploitation of their slave labor, seeking both more land and more slaves to maintain their profits. The drive for more land led them to expand into the Southeast, then beyond the Mississippi into Louisiana and Texas, and eventually to Mexico and the Caribbean. The drive for more slaves led to calls for the reopening of the African slave trade, which had been banned since 1808. This demand for cheaper labor was not unlike the modern-day quest for low-cost workers in Asia and Africa, where human rights are often trampled in the name of profit. The expansion of slavery into new territories was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it promised increased crop yields and political power. On the other hand, it threatened to ignite conflict with the growing number of northern and western farmers and laborers who wanted free soil and fair competition. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which vastly expanded federal power, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opened the entire West to slavery, set the stage for violent confrontations. In Kansas, armed slaveholders from Missouri poured into the territory, intimidating and sometimes violently suppressing the free soil movement. The result was a bloody conflict that foreshadowed the larger Civil War to come. The border states, which included Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, played a crucial role in the slave system. These states found a new source of revenue in the interstate slave trade. While they publicly denied the extent of this trade, it was a well-known and lucrative business. Slaves were deliberately bred for sale, and a laboring stock was created to meet the demands of the cotton planters in the Deep South. This process, which involved the separation of families and the exploitation of women and children, was a stark contradiction to the planters' claims of familial and paternalistic relationships with their slaves. The psychological toll of this system on the planters was profound. They struggled to reconcile their public image as benevolent patriarchs with the harsh realities of the slave trade. The idea of raising black women as brood mares and black children as commodities was deeply troubling, yet it was a practice that many engaged in to ensure their economic survival. The moral degradation of the planters was evident in the rise of a new class of Southern men, cursing, brawling, and whoring gamblers, who represented the worst aspects of the slaveholding culture. One of the most tragic aspects of the slave system was the deliberate separation of families. While planters often claimed to avoid breaking up families, the economic demands of the cotton planters in the Deep South made such separations inevitable. Fathers, mothers, and children were sold off to different masters, leading to a generation of families torn apart. The efforts of freed slaves to reunite with their loved ones after emancipation were often fraught with difficulty and heartbreak. The interstate slave trade, which saw thousands of slaves move from the border states to the Deep South, was a testament to the economic and moral degradation of the system. The sale of slaves was a regular and accepted practice, and the demand for more workers was insatiable. The economic motives behind this trade led to sexual chaos and the exploitation of women and children, practices that were euphemistically described as breeding, but were, in reality, a form of organized human trafficking. The Southern planters, in their desperation to maintain their economic and political power, were increasingly drawn to the idea of secession. They saw the expansion of slavery into the Caribbean and South America as a way to create a vast slave empire. This vision, however, was met with resistance from the border states and the northern and western farmers who sought free soil. The tension between these forces eventually led to the Civil War, a conflict that would determine the future of the nation and the fate of millions of enslaved people. In the end, the sacrifices necessary for economic advancement were too much for the Southern planters to bear. They were unwilling to curtail their consumption or invest in the education and social development of their slaves. Instead, they clung to a reactionary and outdated system that ultimately led to their downfall. The Civil War, with its immense cost in human lives and resources, marked the end of the plantation system and the beginning of a new era for the United States. The legacy of slavery continues to shape American society, a reminder of the profound moral and economic consequences of human exploitation. As we reflect on this history, we must remember the resilience and courage of those who fought for freedom and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The story of slavery is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the human heart and the importance of vigilance in the face of injustice. In the end, the only way forward is through truth, reconciliation, and a commitment to building a more just and equitable society.